In this lecture, you're going to learn how to set attributes on these elements. For example, let's add an image here. We want to set the source attribute. If we have quotes here, whatever we type in between the quotes is rendered as plain static text. In this demo, we want to set the value of the source attribute dynamically. So let's add a property in this state object, call it image URL, and set it to something like this: https picsome photos/200. This will generate a random 200 by 200 pixel image. Now, back to our image element, let's replace the quotes with braces. In the last lecture, you learned that we can use these braces to render values dynamically. So here we want to render this.state.image URL. Save the changes. This is what we get. Beautiful. Now back to our code. So setting attributes is pretty straightforward, but let's look at setting the class and style attributes because they're a little bit different. So I'm going to delete this image element as well as the image URL. Let's say we want to apply a class to this span element. The name of the attribute is not class, it's class name. Because as I told you before, these JSX expressions get compiled to React elements, which are essentially plain JavaScript objects. We cannot use a class property on an object because that's a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So the name of the attribute in JSX is class name. Here I'm going to use a couple of bootstrap classes. One is badge and the other is badge-primary. Save the changes. This is what we get, a blue badge. Now this badge, this span is pretty close to this button. We can add a bit of margin to let the UI breathe. So back in the code, the name of the class is m-2, so margin 2. Save the changes. Now you can see there's a bit of space in between the span and the button. That looks better. Now similarly, let's apply a class to this button. So back in the code, here's our button, class name. We set this to btn, btn-secondary, and btn-sm, which is short for small. Now, if these classes are unfamiliar to you, you need to look at Bootstrap documentation. That's an entirely different topic. We cannot talk about it in my React course. So save the changes. And now our button looks different. That's much better. Now, finally, let's look at applying styles. So for the most part, it's best to use classes. This is for performance and maintainability. But there are times that you may want to break the rules if you know what you're doing, and you may want to apply a style to a specific element. Now, in JSX, we have this style attribute that we need to set to a plain JavaScript object. So first, we need to add curly braces here. Now, in between these curly braces, we need to pass a plain JavaScript object. Here's one way to do this. We can define a property, call it styles, set it to an object. The properties of this object are CSS properties in camel case notation. For example, font weight. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase, but the first letter of every word after is uppercase. Now we can set this to a numerical value like 10, and React will automatically convert this to something like this. So it will append pixels to the end. Actually, this should be font size, not font weight. So font size, 10 pixels, or just a numerical 10. And we can also set font weight to bold. Now we can pass this object here. So this dot styles. Save the changes. Now you can see our text is a little bit smaller and bold. To demonstrate that this is actually working, let me change this to, let's say, 50. Save the changes, and now we have a big badge here. So this is one way to apply styles. We define a property here and then reference it in our JSX expression. But maybe you want to apply styles to a couple of different elements, so you don't want to define multiple properties in this class. If that's the case, you can use inline styles. So here, In between these curly braces, we can just pass an object and set the properties on that object. So let's say font size 30. Now we don't need this styles property anymore. Let's save the changes. With this syntax, we'll get double curly braces. Now back in the browser, you can see our badge, its font size is now 30. In this section, we're only going to use the classes, so I'm going to delete the style attribute. Done. Next, we're going to look at rendering classes dynamically.